Okay, so, as a philosopher, you've probably heard this term postmodernism thrown around.
Oh, yeah.
But what is it really? What does it actually mean? Today, we're taking a deep dive into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to really try to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, and the encyclopedia itself even admits that it's really difficult to actually define postmodernism.
Right.
So what we're going to try to do is distill some of the key ideas and thinkers
Right.
that are presented there and give you kind of a structured overview.
Yeah, and I think, for people listening, don't think of this as like, we're going to read the encyclopedia to you.
Right.
We're going to have a conversation.
Yes.
We're going to explore the arguments,
Exactly.
the key thinkers involved, and how does this all relate to modernity?
Yeah, and our specific mission today is to really give you that philosopher's perspective on this.
Okay.
So we want to look at the origins of these ideas.
Right.
What are the core concepts, and what are some of the major debates that have come about because of it?
All right, so the encyclopedia starts off, and it starts with a pretty interesting statement that I think every philosopher can relate to, which is postmodernism is indefinable. But then it immediately goes on to describe it as a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices, employing concepts such as difference, repetition, the trace, the simulacrum, and hyperreality to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, and the univocity of meaning.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have a paradox.
Right.
I think what's interesting for philosophers here is that even in saying that it's indefinable, they're giving us a functional description of it.
Right.
It's not so much about what it is, but what it does.
Right.
And really, it's kind of like a set of operations that target all these kind of foundational concepts of modern thought.
Okay, so let's talk about, historically.
Mm-hmm.
When did this really solidify as its own, philosophical
Well, the encyclopedia points to 1979,
Okay.
and Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition as being kind of a landmark moment where postmodernism really entered the philosophical lexicon.
Okay.
So Lyotard is a very important figure
Yeah.
in their discussion.
Okay, and beyond Lyotard, whose contributions are they really looking at?
So they focus on 5 French and 2 Italian thinkers.
Okay.
And the way they explain it
Right.
is that these are the figures that are most consistently, engaged with when people talk about postmodernism in philosophy.
Okay, so it's interesting that they would divide it along those national lines.
Right.
For a movement that you would think might be resistant to such categorization.
Yeah, they acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But they suggest that there are kind of discernible
Okay.
intellectual lineages that kind of fall along those lines.
Okay.
So the French thinkers, for example, are often grouped together as post-structuralists.
Okay.
And they were really engaging with this huge structuralist paradigm that was happening in Paris
Right.
in the mid-20th century,
Right.
applying those methods to people like Marx and Freud. And they also saw the events of May 1968 as this really key turning point.
Right. The questioning of authority,
Okay.
the established norms.
Yeah.
And that really does seem to resonate with a lot of the postmodern critique.
Right.
So what about the Italians then? What sets them apart?
So the Italian thinkers, they tend to draw from a really long tradition of aesthetics and rhetoric,
Okay.
going all the way back to figures like Vico and Croce.
Okay.
And they're really more focused on historical analysis.
Okay.
And they're not as fascinated by those moments of revolution like the French thinkers are.
Okay.
They're more interested in concepts of continuity,
Right.
the role of narrative,
Okay.
and how different sort of manifests within these already existing frameworks.
So it's not like a complete break then with modernity.
Right, yeah, and the encyclopedia is very clear about this.
Yeah.
Both the French and the Italian thinkers that they look at.
Right.
They're not saying that postmodernism is like a complete break from modernity. It's more that they're exploring differences and tensions that exist within
Right.
the ongoing project of modernity.
So it's really a continuation in a different mode, you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we get into Lyotard and all these other really key figures, they do take a step back and look at some of the kind of philosophical antecedents
Right.
that paved the way
Yeah.
for this way of thinking.
Right.
So who do they point to there?
So they begin with Kant
Right.
and his Copernican revolution,
Okay.
which was really this huge shift in Western philosophy.
Right.
Moving away from this idea of a mind-independent reality that we can access
Right.
to looking at how the subject, our own cognitive structures,
Okay.
shape the way we understand the world.
Okay.
And they remind us that for Kant, things like God, freedom, immortality, all these concepts,
Right.
they serve a regulative function in our thinking,
Okay.
but they're not actually objects that we can know directly.
Right.
So it's really about how our way of knowing
Right.
shapes what we can know.
Okay. Huge epistemological shift there, right?
Yeah.
From object to subject.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then from Kant, the discussion moves to Hegel,
Okay.
who really complicated this subject-object relationship even further
Okay.
by arguing that, even seemingly immediate experience
Yeah.
is already mediated through these systems of concepts and historical development.
Right.
So even our understanding of a simple this or now
Right.
is embedded in this web of meaning.
Okay.
But the encyclopedia points out that later thinkers would critique Hegel
Okay.
for kind of uncritically presupposing these concepts of identity and negation
Right.
without really accounting for where they came from.
Okay, so even within those grand narratives of modern philosophy, we start to see these seeds of doubt
Yeah.
and self-critique.
Yeah. And then they move to the latter half of the 19th century,
Yeah.
which is really this period marked by all these huge scientific and technological advancements,
Right.
the rise of mass communication,
Right.
and we see this blurring of the boundaries between the natural and the artificial.
Okay.
And this is something that postmodern thinkers would later analyze in terms of this idea of derealization.
Derealization. Okay, that sounds important.
Yeah.
What does that mean in this context?
So in this context, derealization refers to the destabilization of the perceived solidity and constancy of both the experiencing subject
Right.
and the objects of experience.
Okay.
So it's this idea that things aren't as fixed or as solid as we thought they were.
Okay.
And the encyclopedia highlights Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche as key precursors
Okay.
to this idea.
So let's go through those then. So how did Kierkegaard contribute to this idea of derealization?
So Kierkegaard, with his critique of modern abstraction,
Right.
he describes the emergence of what he called the public,
Right.
which is this impersonal and diffuse entity that's created by the rise of mass media.
Wow.
And so for Kierkegaard, this public,
Yeah.
it lacked the concrete bonds of traditional communities. And it represented this kind of realization of abstract thought.
Right.
It was this artificial medium
Right.
that claimed to speak for everyone,
Right.
but was grounded in no one in particular.
Right. Like a loss of individual presence within that generalization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. Then what about Marx? How did his analysis contribute to this idea?
So Marx, through his concept of the fetishism of commodities,
Right.
he shows how objects in capitalist society, they lose their use value
Right.
and become defined by their exchange value.
Okay.
So they become these spectral entities that are contingent on these abstract social relations.
Okay.
And they're kind of divorced from their material reality
Okay.
and the human labor that went into producing them.
Right.
And because these commodities, they embody this alienated labor, Marx argued that the workers themselves experience a form of derealization.
Okay.
They lose their sense of self in the process.
Right, like becoming an appendage of the commodity.
Exactly.
Okay. And then Nietzsche, with his really radical questioning of truth and reality.
Yeah, Nietzsche really articulates this sense of dissolving foundations.
Right.
He famously spoke of being as the last breath of a vaporizing reality.
Right.
And he was challenging this traditional distinction in philosophy
Right.
between the real world and the
Yeah.
apparent world.
Right.
And he goes so far as to say that with the discrediting of the true world, the apparent world also loses its meaning.
Wow.
So we're left with something that's neither really real nor simply illusory.
Yeah.
And it's really striking how much this resembles, what we might call virtual reality today.
Yeah, very prescient.
It is.
Yeah, okay. So reality itself is vaporizing in a sense.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and this theme of the collapsing distinction between the real and the apparent is also central to his early work in The Birth of Tragedy.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
With his exploration of the Apollonian and Dionysian impulses.
Exactly. And, he saw the Apollonian realm of form and image,
Right.
rational order,
Right.
as really becoming dominant in modern thought.
Okay.
And leading to the stifling of the more primal,
Right.
chaotic, life-affirming Dionysian energies.
Okay.
And he saw logic and science as ultimately being frozen Apollonian representations,
Okay.
and argued for this reemergence of the Dionysian
Okay.
as this necessary corrective to the limitations of modern rationality.
So a call for a re-engagement with the irrational, the instinctual.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And then his genealogical inquiries were also very important.
Absolutely.
That's modern thought.
And especially his deconstruction of this seemingly fundamental concept of the I.
Right, the I, the cornerstone of so much modern thought.
Yeah. And Nietzsche argues that the I is not this inherent stable substance, but it's actually a social and historical construct that arises from this moral imperative to hold individuals responsible for their actions.
Okay.
So the idea of this consistent I over time that can be the cause of its own actions is a moral illusion that we project onto the world to make these systems of reward and punishment possible.
So our sense of selfhood isn't a given. It's a product of social and moral needs.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, and he goes on truth and lies in a non-moral sense.
Right.
To talk about how, even scientific concepts are these hardened metaphors at their core.
He's basically extending Hegel's critique of the immediacy of this and now to show how even the act of categorization and repeating instances involves this metaphorical leap and this forgetting of original difference.
Okay, and what about his views on history?
Yeah.
They're also really important for this whole development of postmodern thought.
Yeah, and on the uses and disadvantage of history for life.
Okay.
He offers this really powerful critique of 19th century historicism. And he argues that, for both individuals and cultures to flourish, there needs to be this dynamic interplay between historical awareness and this capacity for unhistorical forgetting. This ability to kind of live in the present moment. And he rejects the idea of history as this linear progression towards some predetermined end. Instead, he sees historical repetition as this process where each age is reinterpreting and representing its own present as something new. And this really connects with Baudelaire's concept of modernity as this fleeting and contingent thing. And this theme is picked up by postmodern thinkers in their engagement with Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return.
So the eternal return, which is so often interpreted as this endless cycle of the same. But the encyclopedia is suggesting a different reading here in the context of postmodernism.
Exactly.
So what is it?
So when you consider it alongside his emphasis on the unhistorical moment and this emergence of the new, postmodern thinkers tend to interpret the eternal return not as this monotonous recurrence of the same, but as this eternal return of difference, the perpetual reemergence of novelty. And they also connect this to this blurring of the boundaries between the real and the apparent to suggest that what returns is not this fixed entity, but a phantasm, a simulacrum that embodies difference.
So that's Nietzsche, and of course you can't talk about Nietzsche without talking about his complicated relationship with Heidegger. So how does Heidegger factor into this prehistory of postmodernism?
So Heidegger's reflections on art, technology, and the withdrawal of being are really central to a lot of postmodern thought. His famous pronouncements about our inability to really understand being and this estrangement of human beings from their own essence. These ideas really resonate with this postmodern sense of derealization. And he saw modern technology not as this neutral set of tools, but as the culmination of Western metaphysics. What he called the metaphysics of presence. That reduces beings to mere resources to be exploited. And his idea of enframing describes how technology imposes this calculative order on everything. Turning a mountain into a source of coal or the Rhine into a supplier of energy.
So technology doesn't just give us instruments. It changes our entire relationship to it.
It structures our understanding.
Okay, so that's powerful. And Heidegger believed that the experience of this withdrawal of being, which often manifests as anxiety or boredom, could open a path toward a new understanding.
He saw this potential in that. And he also saw Nietzsche's concept of the will to power coupled with the eternal return as representing kind of the culmination and the exhaustion of this metaphysical tradition. And actually identifies Nietzsche as the last metaphysician. And Heidegger himself looked to the poet Hölderlin for a more authentic, non-metaphysical way of relating to being.
But the encyclopedia points out that postmodern thinkers often diverge from Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche.
They do, yeah.
So how so?
So a lot of postmodern thinkers see this nostalgia in Heidegger for
Right.
this lost sense of being, this
Yeah.
yearning for this primordial authenticity that they don't necessarily share.
Yeah.
And they find more resonance with Nietzsche's emphasis on forgetting
Right.
and this playful affirmation of the eternal return
Okay.
as this repetition of difference and novelty.
Okay.
And some postmodern thinkers like Lyotard and Lacoue-Labarthe,
Right.
they actually critically examine what they see as Heidegger's own metaphysical presuppositions,
Okay.
particularly in relation to the concept of the other,
Right.
which they sometimes associate with the figure of the Jew.
Okay.
So they're able to engage with Heidegger's thought
Right.
while also distancing themselves from certain aspects of it.
Right. And really importantly, distancing themselves from his involvement with National Socialism.
Right. And it's not so much that they're condemning him morally.
Right.
It's more that they're repositioning him philosophically.
Okay, so using Nietzsche to critique Heidegger in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay, but both Nietzsche and Heidegger remain crucial for this postmodern critique
Yeah.
of the modern subject.
Absolutely.
That I understood as this self-contained conscious entity.
Yeah, so Nietzsche genealogically deconstructs the I as this moral construct.
Right.
And Heidegger sees the subject-centered view
Right.
as marking the end of metaphysics, with
Right.
being as this kind of underlying ground. And
Right.
and his concept of Dasein and being and time
Right.
is an attempt to move beyond that subject-object dichotomy
Okay.
and to think of human existence as this ecstatic temporality that precedes and transcends simple consciousness.
And then, of course, we have Lacan, who brings psychoanalysis into this. So what's his contribution here?
So Lacan's key contribution is his assertion that the Freudian unconscious
Right.
is structured like a language. So
Okay.
it operates according to the symbolic order.
Right.
And for Lacan, the subject isn't this pre-existing entity. It's actually constituted through its entry into language and its relation to the other, which is the symbolic order itself.
Right.
And language as a system of signifiers.
Right.
It transforms these primal needs that we have
Okay.
into specifically human desires.
Okay.
And the most fundamental desire is this desire for recognition from the other.
Okay.
But the problem is that this desire is directed at something that's impossible.
Right.
It's symbolized by the phallus,
Right.
which is the signifier of lack.
Okay.
So we end up with this perpetually divided and incomplete subject.
Right. Sort of echoing Heidegger's Dasein.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've been talking about all these lineages leading up to what we could call postmodernism.
Right.
So let's talk about Lyotard
Okay.
and the postmodern condition, which, as we said, is really the work that brings this term into philosophical discourse.
Right.
So what's his central argument there?
So Lyotard uses Wittgenstein's concept of language games and speech act theory
Okay.
to try to understand these transformations that have been happening in science, art, and literature since the late 19th century.
Okay.
And he describes his own text
As this hybrid form
Okay.
that blends the philosopher's questioning with the expert's kind of assertion of knowledge.
Right.
And he even explicitly says
Right.
that he's not trying to present original truths,
Right.
but to offer what he calls strategically valuable hypotheses.
Okay, so the text itself embodies the transformations he's describing.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And he argues that the rise of the computer age has changed the very nature of knowledge,
Okay.
transforming it into information.
Right.
It's these coded messages
Right, yeah.
that are circulating in these complex systems.
Okay.
And to understand this new landscape,
Yeah.
we need to focus on the pragmatics of communication,
Right.
the rules that govern how these messages are formulated, transmitted, and received.
Okay.
And this brings up the question of legitimation.
Right.
How do we decide what counts as valid knowledge?
Right, right. And how has the relationship between scientific knowledge and what he calls narrative knowledge been affected in this postmodern condition? So Lyotard argues that while modern science has historically tried to separate itself from narrative forms of knowledge like myth and traditional stories, modern philosophy actually tried to provide these overarching narratives, these legitimizing stories for science, like the Hegelian dialectic of spirit or the Enlightenment narrative of the emancipation of reason. But Lyotard says that science, with its focus on denotative language games and empirical verification, it's displaced these meta-narratives, including the philosophical ones. And this is partly driven by these technological advancements that have shifted our focus from the goals of human action to the efficiency of the means.
Okay, so that leads to his famous statement about the postmodern.
Exactly. Incredulity toward meta-narratives. So this fragmentation of knowledge into these specialized domains that lack any overarching coherence. This is a defining feature of the postmodern condition for Lyotard. And he sees derealization as a consequence of this fragmentation, where these grand narratives dissolve into these localized language games, and the subject is moving between these games, leading to this more fluid, less unified sense of self.
So the unifying stories have lost their power.
Yeah, and this creates a kind of void. And Lyotard suggests that the new principle becomes performativity, which is basically optimizing the system's efficiency, maximizing the flow of information, and anything that doesn't contribute to that, like speculative narratives, critical narratives, they risk being delegitimized. But paradoxically, the system needs pararelegy, which is the invention of new rules and new language games.
To keep things going.
Exactly, to prevent stagnation.
So progress isn't about sticking to the rules, it's about changing the rules.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. And he explores the idea of justice further in Just Gaming.
Just Gaming, the different... And he's drawing on Kant's faculties there and the concept of judgment. And he argues that in the absence of this unified subject, the different faculties kind of operate more independently. And this undermines the authority of reason as the ultimate judge of truth and justice.
And so he's proposing aesthetic judgment as a new model.
Yeah, he elevates the faculty of judgment, especially aesthetic judgment as analyzed by Kant in the Third Critique, as this more relevant model for navigating these ethical and political disputes.
Okay, so aesthetic judgment as a model for justice.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big departure.
It is.
From the way we usually think about these things.
And he sees aesthetic judgment as being reflective rather than determinative. So it doesn't start with a concept, but it arises from this interaction and this feeling of harmony or disharmony among the faculties when we encounter something new.
And he sees Kant's concept of the sublime as being particularly relevant here.
Yeah, that experience of the unpresentable that overwhelms the imagination, but also affirms the power of reason. He sees that as really resonating with the postmodern condition and justice in this framework. It's not about applying these universal rules, but it's about being able to move between and make judgments within this multiplicity of language games.
And he even compares it to the creative process in art.
Exactly.
And he further refines this relationship between modern and postmodern art in his essay, What is Postmodernism?
He does.
So what does he say there?
So he argues that modern art, in its pursuit of the new and its engagement with the limits of representation, it embodies the sublime sensibility. It acknowledges the existence of the unpresentable, but it still tries to give it form within these constraints of beauty. He uses Proust as an example. Postmodern art, on the other hand. Joyce. It abandons the pursuit of beauty altogether and directly confronts the unpresentable. And he even says that a work can only become modern if it's first postmodern. So postmodernism isn't the opposite of modernism. It's like its nascent state. It's constant striving to represent the unrepresentable.
So it's a repetition of the modern, but always is something new.
Exactly.
So that's Lyotard. And now the encyclopedia moves on to Foucault. And his genealogical method. So how does this contribute to our understanding of postmodernism?
So Foucault, drawing inspiration from Nietzsche's genealogy, applies it to the study of modern subjectivity and advocates for this ongoing experimentation with different ways of being.
And his 1971 essay, Nietzsche, genealogy history,
Yeah,
is key for understanding his approach.
absolutely.
So what does he say there?
So he emphasizes that genealogy is opposed to the search for origins or underlying essences. It's about looking at the accidents, the contingencies, the power relations that lead to these new epochs, these new concepts.
So history is not this smooth, continuous unfolding.
Right. It's a series of ruptures and contingent events.
Okay.
And he sees the very idea of a unified modernity developing from a single origin as a fiction.
Right.
And his goal is to create this counter-memory
Okay.
that disrupts these dominant narratives of progress
Right.
and reveals these discontinuities and power dynamics.
Okay, and History of Madness is a really great example of this method.
It is.
So how does that work? How does that exemplify this approach?
So in History of Madness, Foucault's looking at the emergence of the modern understanding of reason through its separation from madness in the 17th century.
Okay.
And he argues that the practice of confining people who were deemed mad
Right.
didn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
It evolved from these pre-existing practices, like the confinement of lepers.
Okay.
So you have these existing structures, host speaker,